Ahoy! We have another balance of power, and Dave has addressed some very interesting points here. One in particular that comes down a little bit later that makes me very happy because it very much feels like I've been listened to. But let's start at the beginning. Dave was asked if he was happy with the latest round of changes and said yes, overall he's happy, especially with the new frequency of patches, with the balance patch once a month, which is absolutely fantastic and they have been keeping it up so far, and also with the lower intensity of the changes that comes with that, so they can just make more gradual changes and see what works, instead of slamming the weapon as hard as they did with the musket. He says the overall results are pretty good. For example, the fortify changes allow melees to go for other builds as well, and he is generally happy with the nerfs to the fire staff and the bow. When it comes to the overall state of PvP, he says the state of arena is really good and they're seeing diverse builds with good performance. Wars are also in a good state in his opinion, and OPR in particular sees more melee play, but ranged weapons are still the primarily used weapon. Dave suggests that this may be down to the weapons be relatively solo-friendly, dealing high damage, and also easy to use. Keep in mind when he says easy to use, he probably means in terms of it being easy to get high on the scoreboard with them, and them being easy to use in OPR in particular, where you have open spaces and you can use them relatively safely. I don't think ranged weapons in general are necessarily easier to use, and I don't think Dave thinks that either. That I don't think was the message that he was trying to bring across there. He also says that in terms of pure win rate, fire staff and bow are in the bottom half. Now keep in mind, win rate is obviously not the only statistic. You can look at damage and all that kind of stuff as well, and you have probably different results. But it is important to note this, because when it comes to win rate in OPR in particular, ranged weapons are very good at dealing high damage and fighting off point essentially, but they're not very good at capturing points. And we are going to see changes to the scoring very soon, in the next major patch basically, that will make it so that contesting and capturing points will give you more score in comparison. This will likely incentivize people to go more into melee focused builds so that they can fight around the points so that they can get more score. And that may be something that, without actually changing the dynamics in themselves, may incentivize people to end up playing melee instead just because they want to have higher scores, because a lot of people just like playing for the scores. Of course, there will still also be people that simply like high damage numbers that like to play ranged weapons in general that will keep playing ranged weapons, but I think this will change the distribution a little bit further than balance alone could. Directly talking about the second round of changes that happened recently, Dave said that the data did not indicate need for major changes for weapons, and the balance overall was close enough between weapons. However, they wanted to tweak some hard runes. Dark Ascent is getting some iframes, and Brutal Detonate is getting the self-rend, because currently it's essentially the king of the hill when it comes to hard runes in PvP. But keep in mind, while they didn't want to do any major changes, there are some changes that are now coming with Season 2, so it must have been that since then they've looked at the statistics again and seen some performance shifts and said, okay, based on that, we're doing this and that. We'll get to that in a second. So when it comes to Season 2, there are 4 major changes they wanted to talk about. The first one was the underused and underpowered ability pass. The example that he talked about here was Whirling Blade, and this in particular makes me very, very happy. Now, some of you may remember a video that I made quite a while ago talking about the fundamental sword and shield problems that need to be solved. And I said, when I saw the Season 2 patch notes, that it felt like half of them were something that I would have suggested if somebody asked me how to change and balance current perks and weapons. And these sword and shield changes in particular are very closely aligned with a lot of the things that I suggested for the left tree especially, when it came to the improvements for Sword and Shield. For example, when it came to Whirling Blade, I talked about the animation speed, I talked about the damage output, the overall area in which you can actually hit, and also the tracking or early navigation of the attack, which just kind of locks you in one direction from the start. And exactly all of these are things that Dave is talking about when it comes to the Whirling Blade changes now. On top of that, he also specifically mentioned that Whirling Blade is currently a DPS loss, and listen to what I had to say about that back in that video. 135% weapon damage in a 2 meter radius sounds nice until you consider that you can literally just do 2 light attacks in the same time. And guess which option deals more damage? Even worse, if you're trying to cut down the time by light attack cancelling into a Whirling Blade, it takes as long as 3 light attacks, which means if you spec into it, you're also missing out on the extra slow and bonus damage. Now, I'm not going to arrogantly assume that he watched my video and based the changes on that. Of course not. There's a lot of data going into changes like this as well, and a lot more input than that. But I do at least feel like my testing for Sword and Shield in particular, and the points that are brought up, somehow were reflected in this. Maybe carried through someone else, maybe someone posted about it on the forums afterwards and maybe that post got relayed to someone else, who knows. Or maybe someone on the New World team just ended up watching that video directly. Either way, it makes me very happy to see some feedback that I brought up a while ago somehow make it into the game and see exactly the improvements that I was hoping for. So I'm extremely grateful for these changes, and obviously it also encourages me to make more videos talking about things that I think could be improved in certain ways, just make constructive suggestions and maybe get more of an eye on it, possibly. But there was something else that was interesting that Dave said. He said they were trying to do this type of ability rework for the underpowered ability for every single weapon. Currently, not every single weapon has received a change like that on the first version of the PTR that we have yet to see. For example, the blunderbuss has only received a very minor change, the greatsword has received relatively minor changes, but nothing that would fall under a full ability pass. So it is possible that we'll actually see some more changes later down the line in later stages of PTR. This could also be something that they eventually ended up scrapping, saying, okay, these weapons don't really have an ability that we want to overhaul right now, and this is just something that they thought earlier when they recorded this video. When it comes to blocking, Dave said it's currently inferior to dodging. The first change they did to it was increasing the movement speed while blocking, and the second one was changing the exhaust effect if your block gets broken to no longer reduce your movement speed, unlike if you dodge and go out of stamina where it still reduces your movement speed. But the most important part was the ranged block addition, allowing all weapons that can block to block range damage to some degree and some portion going through as health damage. There's still some very interesting mechanics to figure out with that, because for some weapons it may be better to just take a little bit of damage that can easily be healed again and take less stamina damage in return. And also especially the Ice Gauntlet is a concerning candidate, but that's something we can see on the PTR. They've also said this may not be the end of the blocking changes, so there could be more to come depending on how this goes. They just want to test this on PTR and decide based on the feedback if these are good changes. The third major change is the lifestyle buff removal, making it so that Hale Hearty no longer exists as a buff in town and everyone just gets a little bit more health instead. This is just to make combat more fair and balanced and not depending on town buffs. Now the strange thing here is that he didn't mention Stalwart at all, and Stalwart is mentioned once in the patch notes in one point, but then referring to another change that is not in the patch notes, so I still don't know what's going to happen to Stalwart. I'm assuming it's no longer going to be a town buff, we still don't know what happens to the stamina regeneration in return. And as the fourth change, he talked about balance changes with Season 2. On one hand, in case of the bow, that is primarily dodge and weave, which he thinks just provides way too much mobility overall, so that's getting a nerf, we already know that. And evasive tactics is getting turned into a capstone, so you have to commit a little bit more if you want to go for this heavy dodge playstyle and you cannot do quite as much damage in other ways. The Fire Staff in general deals a lot of damage, and Pillar of Fire in particular is a very high damaging ability for how quick it is and how short the cooldown is, so they're targeting that in particular to nerf that just a little bit in order to dial down the damage output of the Fire Staff, just a tiny amount. This is not going to make or break the Fire Staff. Now, Diablo is coming out soon, and the new PTR with a lot of these changes is coming out soon. Gonna play both, and I want to talk a little bit about my plans regarding that. I will link that video right here, it'll come out later today, and I'll explain in detail what my plan for the coming month or so is. A lot of that will be happening over on Twitch TV/DukeSloth, links down in the description, and of course, if you want to see more videos like this, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. Thanks to my patrons for supporting this video, and thank you for watching. DukeSloth, out.